lost all meaning for me. I was an insignificant microbe being twisted and twirled. The motion slowed down by degrees. There was one more jolt before everything came to a halt. I tried to look around. I had no point of reference. I seemed to be planted like a tree. Above me, there was a white, shiny, inconceivably big dome. Its presence made me feel elated. I flew toward it, or rather, I was ejected like a projectile. I had the sensation of being comfortable, nurtured, secure. The closer I got to the dome, the more intense those feelings became. They finally overwhelmed me, and I lost all sense of myself. The next thing I knew, I was rocking slowly in the air like a leaf that falls. I felt exhausted. A suction force started to pull me. I went through a dark hole, and then I was with Don Juan and Genaro. The next day, Don Juan, Genaro, and I went to Oaxaca. While Don Juan and I strolled around the main square in the later afternoon, he suddenly started to talk about what we had done the day before. He asked me if I had understood what he was referring to when he said that the old seers had stumbled onto something monumental. I told him that I did, but that I couldn't explain it in words.
And what do you think was the main thing we wanted you to find out on top of that mountain?
He asked.
Alignment,
a voice said in my ear. At the same time, I said it myself. I turned around in a reflex action and bumped into Genaro, who was just behind me, walking in my tracks. The speed of my movement startled him. He broke into a giggle and then embraced me. We sat down. Don Juan said that there were very few things that he could say about the boost I had gotten from the earth, that warriors are always alone in such cases, and true realizations come much later, after years of struggle. I told Don Juan that my problem in understanding was magnified by the fact that he and Genaro were doing all the work. I was simply a passive subject who could only react to their maneuvers. I couldn't, for the life of me, initiate any action because I didn't know what a proper action should be, nor did I know how to initiate it.
That's precisely the point,
Don Juan said.
You're not supposed to know yet. You are going to be left behind, by yourself, to reorganize on your own everything we are doing to you now. This is the task every Nagual has to face. The Nagual Julian did the same thing to me, much more ruthlessly than the way we do it to you. He knew what he was doing. He was a brilliant Nagual who was able to reorganize in a few years everything the Nagual Elias had taught him. He did, in no time at all, something that would take a lifetime for you or for me. The difference was that all the Nagual Julian ever needed was a slight insinuation. His awareness would take it from there and open the only door there is.
What do you mean, Don Juan, by the only door there is?
I mean that when man's assemblage point moves beyond a crucial limit, the results are always the same for every man. The techniques to make it move may be as different as they can be, but the results are always the same, meaning that the assemblage point assembles other worlds aided by the boost from the Earth.
Is the boost from the Earth the same for every man, Don Juan?
Of course. The difficulty for the average man is the internal dialogue. Only when a state of total silence is attained can one use the boost. You will corroborate that truth the day you try to use that boost by yourself.
I wouldn't recommend that you try it, Genaro said sincerely. It takes years to become an impeccable warrior. In order to withstand the impact of the Earth's boost, you must be better than you are now.
The speed of that boost will dissolve everything about you, Don Juan said. Under its impact, we become nothing. Speed and the sense of individual existence don't go together. Yesterday on the mountain, Genaro and I supported you and served as your anchors. Otherwise, you wouldn't have returned. You'd be like some men who purposely used that boost and went into the unknown and are still roaming in some incomprehensible immensity.
I wanted him to elaborate on that, but he refused. He changed the subject abruptly.
There's one thing you haven't understood yet about the Earth's being a sentient being, he said. And Genaro, this awful Genaro, wants to push you until you understand.
Both of them laughed. Genaro playfully shoved me and winked at me as he mouthed the words, "I am awful."
Genaro is a terrible taskmaster, mean and ruthless, Don Juan continued. He doesn't give a hoot about your fears and pushes you mercilessly. If it wasn't for me...
He was a perfect picture of a good, thoughtful old gentleman. He lowered his eyes and sighed. The two of them broke into roaring laughter. When they had quieted down, Don Juan said that Genaro wanted to show me what I had not understood yet, that the supreme awareness of the earth is what makes it possible for us to change into other great bands of emanations.
We living beings are perceivers, he said, and we perceive because some emanations inside man's cocoon become aligned with some emanations outside. Alignment, therefore, is the secret passageway, and the Earth's boost is the key. Genaro wants you to watch the moment of alignment. Watch him.
Genaro stood up like a showman and took a bow, then showed us that he had nothing up his sleeves or inside the legs of his pants. He took his shoes off and shook them to show that there was nothing concealed there either. Don Juan was laughing with total abandon. Genaro moved his hands up and down. The movement created an immediate fixation in me. I sensed that the three of us suddenly got up and walked away from the square, the two of them flanking me. As we continued walking, I lost my peripheral vision. I didn't distinguish any more houses or streets. I didn't notice any mountains or any vegetation either. At one moment, I realized that I had lost sight of Don Juan and Genaro. Instead, I saw two luminous bundles moving up and down beside me. I felt an instantaneous panic, which I immediately controlled. I had the unusual but well-known sensation that I was myself, and yet I was not. I was aware, however, of everything around me by means of a strange and at the same time most familiar capacity. The sight of the world came to me all at once. All of me saw. The entirety of what I, in my normal consciousness, call my body was capable of sensing as if it were an enormous eye that detected everything. What I first detected after seeing the two blobs of light was a sharp, violet-purple world made out of something that looked like colored panels and canopies. Flat, screen-like panels of irregular concentric circles were everywhere. I felt a great pressure all over me, and then I heard a voice in my ear. I was seeing. The voice said that the pressure was due to the act of moving. I was moving together with Don Juan and Genaro. I felt a faint jolt, as if I had broken a paper barrier, and I found myself facing a luminescent world. Light radiated from every place, but without being glaring. It was as if the sun were about to erupt from behind some white, diaphanous clouds. I was looking down into the source of light. It was a beautiful sight. There were no land masses, just fluffy white clouds and light. And we were walking on the clouds. Then something imprisoned me again. I moved at the same pace as the two blobs of light by my sides. Gradually, they began to lose their brilliance, then became opaque, and finally they were Don Juan and Genaro. We were walking on a deserted side street, away from the main square. Then we turned back.
Genaro just helped you to align your emanations with those emanations at large that belong to another band,
Don Juan said to me.
Alignment has to be a very peaceful, unnoticeable act. No flying away, no great fuss.
He said that the sobriety needed to let the assemblage point assemble other worlds is something that cannot be improvised. Sobriety has to mature and become a force in itself before warriors can break the barrier of perception with impunity. We were coming closer to the main square. Genaro had not said a word. He walked in silence as if absorbed in thought. Just before we came into the square, Don Juan said that Genaro wanted to show me one more thing, that the position of the assemblage point is everything, and that the world it makes us perceive is so real that it does not leave room for anything except realness.
Genaro will let his assemblage point assemble another world just for your benefit,
Don Juan said to me.
And then you'll realize that as he perceives it, the force of his perception will leave room for nothing else.
Genaro walked ahead of us, and Don Juan ordered me to roll my eyes in a counterclockwise direction while I looked at Genaro to avoid being dragged with him. I obeyed him. Genaro was 5 or 6 feet away from me. Suddenly, his shape became diffuse, and in one instant, he was gone, like a puff of air. I thought of the science fiction movies I had seen, and wondered whether we are subliminally aware of our possibilities.
Genaro is separated from us at this moment by the force of perception,
Don Juan said quietly.
When the assemblage point assembles a world, that world is total. This is the marvel that the old seers stumbled upon and never realized what it was. The awareness of the earth can give us a boost to align other great bands of emanations, and the force of that new alignment makes the world vanish. Every time the old seers made a new alignment, they believed they had descended to the depths below or ascended to the heavens above. They never knew that the world disappears like a puff of air when a new total alignment makes us perceive another total world.
Chapter 14. The Rolling Force. Don Juan was about to start his explanation of the mastery of awareness, but he changed his mind and stood up. We had been sitting in the big room, observing a moment of quiet.
I want you to try seeing the eagle's emanations, he said. For that you must first move your assemblage point until you see the cocoon of man.
We walked from the house to the center of town. We sat down on an empty, worn park bench in front of the church. It was early afternoon, a sunny, windy day with lots of people milling around. He repeated, as if he were trying to drill it into me, that alignment is a unique force because it either helps the assemblage point shift or it keeps it glued to its customary position. The aspect of alignment that keeps the point stationary, he said, is will, and the aspect that makes it shift is intent. He remarked that one of the most haunting mysteries is how will, the impersonal force of alignment, changes into intent, the personalized force, which is at the service of each individual.
The strangest part of this mystery is that the change is so easy to accomplish, he went on. But what is not so easy is to convince ourselves that it is possible. There, right there, is our safety catch. We have to be convinced, and none of us wants to be.
He told me then that I was in my keenest state of awareness, and that it was possible for me to intend my assemblage point to shift deeper into my left side, to a dreaming position. He said that warriors should never attempt seeing unless they are aided by dreaming. I argued that to fall asleep in public was not one of my fortes. He clarified his statement, saying that to move the assemblage point away from its natural setting and to keep it fixed at a new location is to be asleep. With practice, seers learn to be asleep and yet behave as if nothing is happening to them. After a moment's pause, he added that for purposes of seeing the cocoon of man, one has to gaze at people from behind as they walk away. It's useless to gaze at people face to face, because the front of the egg-like cocoon of man has a protective shield, which seers call the front plate. It is an almost impregnable, unyielding shield that protects us throughout our lives against the onslaught of a peculiar force that stems from the emanations themselves. He also told me not to be surprised if my body was stiff, as though it were frozen. He said that I was going to feel very much like someone standing in the middle of a room looking at the street through a window, and that speed was of the essence, as people were going to move extremely fast by my seeing window. He told me then to relax my muscles, shut off my internal dialogue, and let my assemblage point drift away under the spell of inner silence. He urged me to smack myself gently but firmly on my right side, between my hip bone and my rib cage. I did that 3 times, and I was sound asleep. It was a most peculiar state of sleep. My body was dormant, but I was perfectly aware of everything that was taking place. I could hear Don Juan talking to me, and I could follow every one of his statements as if I were awake, yet I could not move my body at all. Don Juan said that a man was going to walk by my seeing window and that I should try to see him. I unsuccessfully attempted to move my head, and then a shiny egg-like shape appeared. It was resplendent. I was awed by the sight, and before I could recover from my surprise, it was gone. It floated away, bobbing up and down. Everything had been so sudden and fast that it made me feel frustrated and impatient. I felt that I was beginning to wake up. Don Juan talked to me again and urged me to relax. He said that I had no right and no time to be impatient. Suddenly, another luminous being appeared and moved away. It seemed to be made of a white fluorescent shag. Don Juan whispered in my ear that if I wanted to, my eyes were capable of slowing down everything they focused on. Then he warned me that another man was coming. I realized at that instant that there were 2 voices. The one I had just heard was the same one that had admonished me to be patient. That was Don Juan's. The other, the one that told me to use my eyes to slow down movement, was the voice of seeing. That afternoon, I saw 10 luminous beings in slow motion. The voice of seeing guided me to witness in them everything Don Juan had told me about the glow of awareness. There was a vertical band with a stronger amber glow on the right side of those egg-like luminous creatures, perhaps 1/10 of the total volume of the cocoon. The voice said that was man's band of awareness. The voice pointed out a dot on man's band, a dot with an intense shine. It was high on the oblong shapes, almost on the crest of them, on the surface of the cocoon. The voice said that it was the assemblage point. When I saw each luminous creature in profile from the point of view of its body, its egg-like shape was like a gigantic asymmetrical yo-yo that was standing edgewise, or like an almost round pot that was resting on its side with the lid on. The part that looked like a lid was the front plate. It was perhaps 1/5 the thickness of the total cocoon. I would have gone on seeing those creatures, but Don Juan said that I should now gaze at people face to face and sustain my gaze until I had broken the barrier and I was seeing the emanations. I followed his command. Almost instantaneously, I saw a most brilliant array of live, compelling fibers of light. It was a dazzling sight that immediately shattered my balance. I fell down on the cement walk on my side. From there, I saw the compelling fibers of light multiply themselves. They burst open, and myriads of other fibers came out of them. But the fibers, compelling as they were, somehow did not interfere with my ordinary view.
There were scores of people going into church. I was no longer seeing them. There were quite a few women and men just around the bench. I wanted to focus my eyes on them, but instead I noticed how one of those fibers of light bulged suddenly. It became like a ball of fire that was perhaps 7 feet in diameter. It rolled on me. My first impulse was to roll out of its way. Before I could even move a muscle, the ball had hit me. I felt it as clearly as if someone had punched me gently in the stomach. An instant later, another ball of fire hit me, this time with considerably more strength, and then Don Juan whacked me really hard on the cheek with his open hand. I jumped up involuntarily and lost sight of the fibers of light and the balloons that were hitting me. Don Juan said that I had successfully endured my first brief encounter with the eagle's emanations, but that a couple of shoves from the tumbler had dangerously opened up my gap. He added that the balls that had hit me were called the rolling force, or the tumbler. We had returned to his house, although I didn't remember how or when. I had spent hours in a sort of semi-sleeping state. Don Juan and the other seers of his group had given me large amounts of water to drink. They had also submerged me in an ice-cold tub of water for short periods of time. Were those fibers I saw the eagle's emanations? I asked Don Juan. Yes, but you didn't really see them, he replied. No sooner had you begun to see than the tumbler stopped you. If you had remained a moment longer, it would have blasted you. What exactly is the tumbler? I asked. It's a force from the eagle's emanations, he said. A ceaseless force that strikes us every instant of our lives. It is lethal when seen, but otherwise we are oblivious to it in our ordinary lives because we have protective shields. We have consuming interests that engage all our awareness. We are permanently worried about our station, our possessions. These shields, however, do not keep the tumbler away. They simply keep us from seeing it directly, protecting us in this way from getting hurt by the fright of seeing the balls of fire hitting us. Shields are a great help and a great hindrance to us. They pacify us and, at the same time, fool us. They give us a false sense of security. He warned me that a moment would come in my life when I would be without any shields, uninterruptedly at the mercy of the tumbler. He said that it is an obligatory stage in the life of a warrior, known as losing the human form. I asked him to explain to me once and for all what the human form is and what it means to lose it. He replied that seers describe the human form as the compelling force of alignment of the emanations lit by the glow of awareness on the precise spot on which normally man's assemblage point is fixated. It is the force that makes us into persons. Thus, to be a person is to be compelled to affiliate with that force of alignment and consequently to be affiliated with the precise spot where it originates. By reason of their activities at a given moment, the assemblage points of warriors drift toward the left. It is a permanent move, which results in an uncommon sense of aloofness, or control, or even abandon. That drift of the assemblage point entails a new alignment of emanations. It is the beginning of a series of greater shifts. Seers very aptly called this initial shift losing the human form, because it marks an inexorable movement of the assemblage point away from its original setting, resulting in the irreversible loss of our affiliation to the force that makes us persons. He asked me then to describe all the details I could remember about the balls of fire. I told him that I had seen them so briefly I wasn't sure I could describe them in detail. He pointed out that seeing is a euphemism for moving the assemblage point, and that if I moved mine a fraction more to the left, I would have a clear picture of the balls of fire, a picture which I could interpret then as having remembered them.
I tried to have a clear picture, but I couldn't, so I described what I remembered. He listened attentively and then urged me to recall if they were balls or circles of fire. I told him I didn't remember. He explained that those balls of fire are of crucial importance to human beings because they are the expression of a force that pertains to all details of life and death, something that the New Seers called the rolling force. I asked him to clarify what he meant by all the details of life and death.
The rolling force is the means through which the eagle distributes life and awareness for safekeeping, he said. But it is also the force that, let's say, collects the rent. It makes all living beings die. What you saw today was called by the ancient seers the tumbler.
He said that seers describe it as an eternal line of iridescent rings or balls of fire that roll onto living beings ceaselessly. Luminous organic beings meet the rolling force head-on until the day when the force proves to be too much for them and the creatures finally collapse. The old seers were mesmerized by seeing how the tumbler then tumbles them into the beak of the eagle to be devoured. That was the reason they called it the tumbler. You said that it is a mesmerizing sight. Have you yourself seen it rolling human beings? I asked.
Certainly I've seen it,
he replied, and after a pause he added,
You and I saw it only a short while ago in Mexico City.
His assertion was so far-fetched that I felt obliged to tell him that this time he was wrong. He laughed and reminded me that on that occasion, while both of us were sitting on a bench in the Alameda Park in Mexico City, we had witnessed the death of a man. He said that I had recorded the event in my everyday life memory, as well as in my left side emanations. As Don Juan spoke to me, I had the sensation of something inside me becoming lucid by degrees, and I could visualize with uncanny clarity the whole scene in the park. The man was lying on the grass with 3 policemen standing by him to keep onlookers away. I distinctly remembered Don Juan hitting me on my back to make me change levels of awareness, and then I saw. My seeing was imperfect. I was unable to shake off the sight of the world of everyday life. What I ended up with was a composite of filaments of the most gorgeous colors superimposed on the buildings and the traffic. The filaments were actually lines of colored light that came from above. They had inner life. They were bright and bursting with energy. When I looked at the dying man, I saw what Don Juan was talking about. Something that was at once like circles of fire or iridescent tumbleweeds was rolling everywhere I focused my eyes. The circles were rolling on people, on Don Juan, on me. I felt them in my stomach and became ill. Don Juan told me to focus my eyes on the dying man. I saw him at one moment curling up just as a sowbug curls itself up upon being touched. The incandescent circles pushed him away as if they were casting him aside, out of their majestic, inalterable path. I had not liked the feeling. The circles of fire had not scared me. They were not awesome or sinister. I did not feel morbid or somber. The circles rather had nauseated me. I'd felt them in the pit of my stomach. It was a revulsion that I'd felt that day. Remembering them conjured up again the total feeling of discomfort I had experienced on that occasion. As I got ill, Don Juan laughed until he was out of breath.
You're such an exaggerated fellow, he said. The rolling force is not that bad. It's lovely, in fact. The new seers recommend that we open ourselves to it. The old seers also opened themselves to it, but for reasons and purposes guided mostly by self-importance and obsession. The new seers, on the other hand, make friends with it. They become familiar with that force by handling it without any self-importance. The result is staggering in its consequences.
He said that a shift of the assemblage point is all that is needed to open oneself to the rolling force. He added that if the force is seen in a deliberate manner, there is minimal danger. A situation that is extremely dangerous, however, is an involuntary shift of the assemblage point, owing perhaps to physical fatigue, emotional exhaustion, disease, or simply a minor emotional or physical crisis, such as being frightened or being drunk.
When the assemblage point shifts involuntarily, the rolling force cracks the cocoon, he went on. I've talked many times about a gap that man has below his navel. It's not really below the navel itself, but in the cocoon at the height of the navel. The gap is more like a dent, a natural flaw in the otherwise smooth cocoon. It is where the tumbler hits us ceaselessly, and where the cocoon cracks.
He went on to explain that if it is a minor shift of the assemblage point, the crack is very small. The cocoon quickly repairs itself, and people experience what everybody has at one time or another: blotches of color and contorted shapes, which remain even if the eyes are closed. If the shift is considerable, the crack also is extensive, and it takes time for the cocoon to repair itself, as in the case of warriors who purposely use power plants to elicit that shift, or people who take drugs and unwittingly do the same. In these cases, men feel numb and cold. They have difficulty talking or even thinking. It is as if they have been frozen from inside. Don Juan said that in cases in which the assemblage point shifts drastically because of the effects of trauma or of a mortal disease, the rolling force produces a crack the length of the cocoon. The cocoon collapses and curls in on itself, and the individual dies. Can a voluntary shift also produce a gap of that nature? I asked.
Sometimes, he replied. We're really frail. As the tumbler hits us over and over, death comes to us through the gap. Death is the rolling force. When it finds weakness in the gap of a luminous being, it automatically cracks it open and makes it collapse.
Does every living being have a gap? I asked.
Of course, he replied. If it didn't have one, it wouldn't die. The gaps are different, however, in size and configuration. Man's gap is a bowl-like depression the size of a fist, a very frail, vulnerable configuration. The gaps of other organic creatures are very much like man's. Some are stronger than ours and others are weaker, but the gap of inorganic beings is really different. It's more like a long thread, a hair of luminosity. Consequently, inorganic beings are infinitely more durable than we are. There is something hauntingly appealing about the long life of those creatures, and the old seers could not resist being carried away by that appeal.
He said that the same force can produce two effects that are diametrically opposed. The old seers were imprisoned by the rolling force, and the new seers are rewarded for their toils with the gift of freedom. By becoming familiar with the rolling force through the mastery of intent, the new seers at a given moment open their own cocoons, and the force floods them rather than rolling them up like a curled-up salva. The final result is their total and instantaneous disintegration. I asked him a lot of questions about the survival of awareness after the luminous being is consumed by the fire from within. He didn't answer. He simply chuckled, shrugged his shoulders, and went on to say that the old seer's obsession with the tumbler blinded them to the other side of that force. The new seers, with their usual thoroughness in refusing tradition, went to the other extreme. They were at first totally averse to focusing their seeing on the tumbler. They argued that they needed to understand the force of the emanations at large in its aspect of life-giver and enhancer of awareness.
They realized that it is infinitely easier to destroy something, Don Juan went on, than it is to build it and maintain it. To roll life away is nothing compared to giving it and nourishing it. Of course, the new seers were wrong on this count, but in due course, they corrected their mistake.
How are they wrong, Don Juan?
It's an error to isolate anything for seeing. At the beginning, the new seers did exactly the opposite from what their predecessors did. They focused with equal attention on the other side of the tumbler. What happened to them was as terrible, if not worse, than what happened to the old seers. They died stupid deaths, just as the average man does. They didn't have the mystery or the malignancy of the ancient seers, nor had they the quest for freedom of the seers of today. Those first new seers served everybody, because they were focusing their seeing on the life-giving side of the emanations. They were filled with love and kindness, but that didn't keep them from being tumbled. They were vulnerable, just as were the old seers who were filled with morbidity.
He said that for the modern-day new seers, to be left stranded after a life of discipline and toil, just like men who have never had a purposeful moment in their lives, was intolerable. Don Juan said that these new seers realized, after they had readopted their tradition, that the old seers' knowledge of the rolling force had been complete. At one point, the old seers had concluded that there were, in effect, two different aspects of the same force. The tumbling aspect relates exclusively to destruction and death. The circular aspect, on the other hand, is what maintains life and awareness, fulfillment and purpose. They had chosen, however, to deal exclusively with the tumbling aspect.
Gazing in teams, the new seers were able to see the separation between the tumbling and the circular aspects, he explained. They saw that both forces are fused but are not the same. The circular force comes to us just before the tumbling force. They are so close to each other that they seem the same. The reason it's called the circular force is that it comes in rings, thread-like hoops of iridescence, a very delicate affair indeed. And just like the tumbling force, it strikes all living beings ceaselessly, but for a different purpose. It strikes them to give them strength, direction, awareness, to give them life. What the new seers discovered is that the balance of the two forces in every living being is a very delicate one, he continued. If at any given time an individual feels that the tumbling force strikes harder than the circular one, that means the balance is upset. The tumbling force strikes harder and harder from then on until it cracks the living being's gap and makes it die.
He added that out of what I had called balls of fire comes an iridescent hoop exactly the size of living beings, whether men, trees, microbes, or allies.
Are there different sized circles? I asked. Don't take me so literally, he protested. There are no circles to speak of, just a circular force that gives seers who are dreaming it the feeling of rings. And there are no different sizes either. It's one indivisible force that fits all living beings, organic and inorganic.
Why did the old seers focus on the tumbling aspect? I asked.
Because they believed that their lives depended on seeing it, he replied. They were sure that their seeing was going to give them answers to age-old questions. You see, they figured that if they unraveled the secrets of the rolling force, they would be invulnerable and immortal. The sad part is that in one way or another they did unravel the secrets, and yet they were neither invulnerable nor immortal. The new seers changed it all by realizing that there is no way to aspire to immortality as long as man has a cocoon.
Don Juan explained that the old seers apparently never realized that the human cocoon is a receptacle and cannot sustain the onslaught of the rolling force forever. In spite of all the knowledge that they had accumulated, they were in the end certainly no better and perhaps much worse off than the average man. In what way were they left worse off than the average man? I asked.
Their tremendous knowledge forced them to take it for granted that their choices were infallible, he said. So they chose to live at any cost.
Don Juan looked at me and smiled. With his theatrical pause, he was telling me something I could not fathom.
They chose to live, he repeated. Just as they chose to become trees in order to assemble worlds with those nearly unreachable great bands.
What do you mean by that, Don Juan?
I mean that they used the rolling force to shift their assemblage points to unimaginable, dreaming positions, instead of letting it roll them to the beak of the eagle to be devoured.
Chapter 15. The Death Defiers. I arrived at Genaro's house around 2 p.m. Don Juan and I became involved in conversation, and then Don Juan made me shift into heightened awareness.
Here we are again, the three of us, just as we were the day we went to that flat rock, Don Juan said. And tonight, we're going to make another trip to that area. You have enough knowledge now to draw very serious conclusions about that place and its effects on awareness.
What is it with that place, Don Juan?
Tonight, you're going to find out some gruesome facts that the old seers collected about the rolling force, and you're going to see what I meant when I told you that the old seers chose to live at any cost.
Don Juan turned to Genaro, who was about to fall asleep. He nudged him.
Wouldn't you say, Genaro, that the old seers were dreadful men? Don Juan asked.
Absolutely, Genaro said in a crisp tone, and then seemed to succumb to fatigue. He began to nod noticeably. In an instant, he was sound asleep, his head resting on his chest with his chin tucked in. He snored. I wanted to laugh out loud, but then I noticed that Genaro was staring at me, as if he were sleeping with his eyes open. They were such dreadful men that they even defied death, Genaro added between snores.
Aren't you curious to know how those gruesome men defied death? Don Juan asked me.
He seemed to be urging me to ask for an example of their gruesomeness. He paused and looked at me with what I thought was a glint of expectation in his eyes. You're waiting for me to ask for an example, aren't you? I said.
This is a great moment, he said, patting me on the back and laughing. My benefactor had me on the edge of my seat at this point. I asked him to give me an example, and he did. Now I'm going to give you one whether you ask for it or not.
What are you going to do? I asked, so frightened that my stomach was tied in knots and my voice cracked. It took quite a while for Don Juan to stop laughing. Every time he started to speak, he'd get an attack of coughing laughter.
As Genaro told you, the old seers were dreadful men, he said, rubbing his eyes. There was something they tried to avoid at all costs. They didn't want to die. You may say that the average man doesn't want to die either, but the advantage that the old seers had over the average man was that they had the concentration and the discipline to intend things away, and they actually intended death away.
He paused and looked at me with raised eyebrows. He said that I was falling behind, that I wasn't asking my usual questions. I remarked that it was plain to me that he was leading me to ask if the old seers had succeeded in intending death away, but he himself had already told me that their knowledge about the tumbler had not saved them from dying.
They succeeded in intending death away,
he said, pronouncing his words with extra care.
But they still had to die.
How did they intend death away? I asked.
They observed their allies,
he said,
and seeing that they were living beings with a much greater resilience to the rolling force, the seers patterned themselves on their allies.
The old seers realized, Don Juan explained, that only organic beings have a gap that resembles a bowl. Its size and shape and its brittleness make it the ideal configuration to hasten the cracking and collapsing of the luminous shell under the onslaughts of the tumbling force. The allies, on the other hand, who have only a line for a gap, present such a small surface to the rolling force as to be practically immortal. Their cocoons can sustain the onslaughts of the tumbler indefinitely, because hairline gaps offer no ideal configuration to it.
The old seers developed the most bizarre techniques for closing their gaps,
Don Juan continued.
They were essentially correct in assuming that a hairline gap is more durable than a bowl-like one.
Are those techniques still in existence? I asked.
No, they are not,
he said.
But some of the seers who practice them are.
For reasons unknown to me, his statement caused a reaction of sheer terror in me. My breathing was altered instantly, and I couldn't control its rapid pace.
They're still alive to this day, isn't that so, Genaro?
Don Juan asked. Absolutely, Genaro muttered from an apparent state of deep sleep. I asked Don Juan if he knew the reason for my being so frightened. He reminded me about a previous occasion in that very room when they had asked me if I had noticed the weird creatures that had come in the moment Genaro opened the door.
That day, your assemblage point went very deep into the left side and assembled a frightening world,
he went on.
But I have already said that to you. What you don't remember is that you went directly to a very remote world and scared yourself pissless there.
Don Juan turned to Genaro, who was snoring peacefully with his legs stretched out in front of him.
Wasn't he scared pissless, Genaro?
He asked. Absolutely pissless, Genaro muttered, and Don Juan laughed.
I want you to know that we don't blame you for being scared,
Don Juan continued.
We ourselves are revolted by some of the actions of the old seers. I'm sure that you have realized by now that what you can't remember about that night is that you saw the old seers who are still alive.
I wanted to protest that I had realized nothing, but I couldn't voice my words. I had to clear my throat over and over before I could articulate a word. Genaro had stood up and was gently patting my upper back by my neck, as if I were choking. "You have a frog in your throat," he said. I thanked him in a high, squeaky voice. "No, I think you have a chicken there," he added, and sat down to sleep. Don Juan said that the new seers had rebelled against all the bizarre practices of the old seers and declared them not only useless but injurious to our total being. They even went so far as to ban those techniques from whatever was taught to new warriors, and for generations there was no mention of those practices at all. It was in the early part of the 18th century that the Nagual Sebastián, a member of Don Juan's direct line of Naguals, rediscovered the existence of those techniques. How did he rediscover them? I asked.
He was a superb stalker, and because of his impeccability, he got a chance to learn marvels,
Don Juan replied. He said that one day, as the Nagual Sebastián was about to start his daily routines, he was the sexton at the cathedral in the city where he lived. He found a middle-aged Indian man who seemed to be in a quandary at the door of the church. The Nagual Sebastian went to the man's side and asked him if he needed help. "I need a bit of energy to close my gap," the man said to him in a loud, clear voice. "Would you give me some of your energy?" Don Juan said that according to the story, the Nagual Sebastian was dumbfounded. He didn't know what the man was talking about. He offered to take the Indian to see the parish priest. The man lost his patience and angrily accused the Nagual Sebastian of stalling. "I need your energy because you're a Nagual," he said. "Let's go quietly." The Nagual Sebastian succumbed to the magnetic power of the stranger and meekly went with him into the mountains. He was gone for many days. When he came back, he not only had a new outlook about the ancient seers, but detailed knowledge of their techniques. The stranger was an ancient Toltec, one of the last survivors. The Nagual Sebastian found out marvels about the old seers, Don Juan went on. He was the one who first knew how grotesque and aberrant they really were. Before him, that knowledge was only hearsay. One night, my benefactor and the Nagual Elias gave me a sample of those aberrations. They really showed it to Genaro and me together, so it's only proper that we both show you the same sample. I wanted to talk in order to stall. I needed time to calm down, to think things out. But before I could say anything, Don Juan and Genaro were practically dragging me out of the house. They headed for the same eroded hills we had visited before. We stopped at the bottom of a large, barren hill. Don Juan pointed towards some distant mountains to the south and said that between the place where we stood and a natural cut in one of those mountains, a cut that looked like an open mouth, there were at least 7 sites where the ancient seers had focused all the power of their awareness. Don Juan said that those seers had not only been knowledgeable and daring, but downright successful. He added that his benefactor had showed him and Genaro a site where the old seers, driven by their love for life, had buried themselves alive and actually intended the rolling force away. "There is nothing that would catch the eye in those places," he went on. "The old seers were careful not to leave marks. It is just a landscape. One has to see to know where those places are." He said that he didn't want to walk to the faraway sites, but would take me to the one that was nearest. I insisted on knowing what we were after. He said that we were going to see the buried seers, and that, for that, we had to stay until it got dark under the cover of some green bushes. He pointed them out. They were perhaps half a mile away up a steep slope. We reached the patch of bushes and sat down as comfortably as we could. He began then to explain in a very low voice that in order to get energy from the earth, ancient seers used to bury themselves for periods of time, depending on what they wanted to accomplish. The more difficult their task, the longer their burial period. Don Juan stood up and in a melodramatic way showed me a spot a few yards from where we were. "2 old seers are buried there," he said. "They buried themselves about 2,000 years ago to escape death, not in the spirit of running away from it, but in the spirit of defying it." Don Juan asked Genaro to show me the exact spot where the old seers were buried. I turned to look at Genaro and realized that he was sitting by my side, sound asleep again. But to my utter amazement, he jumped up and barked like a dog and ran on all 4s to the spot Don Juan was pointing out. There, he ran around the place in a perfect mime of a small dog. I found his performance hilarious. Don Juan was nearly on the ground laughing. "Genaro has shown you something extraordinary," Don Juan said, after Genaro had returned to where we were and had gone back to sleep. "He has shown you something about the assemblage point in dreaming.
He's dreaming now, but he can act as if he were fully awake, and he can hear everything you say. From that position, he can do more than if he were awake."
He was silent for a moment, as if assessing what to say next. Genaro snored rhythmically. Don Juan remarked how easy it was for him to find flaws with what the old seers had done. Yet, in all fairness, he never tired of repeating how wonderful their accomplishments were. He said that they understood the earth to perfection. Not only did they discover and use the boost from the earth, but they also discovered that if they remained buried, their assemblage points aligned emanations that were ordinarily inaccessible, and that such an alignment engaged the Earth's strange, inexplicable capacity to deflect the ceaseless strikes of the rolling force. Consequently, they developed the most astounding and complex techniques for burying themselves for extremely long periods of time without any detriment to themselves. In their fight against death, they learned how to elongate those periods to cover millennia. It was a cloudy day, and night fell quickly. In no time at all, everything was in darkness. Don Juan stood up and guided me and the sleepwalker Genaro to an enormous, flat oval rock that had caught my eye the moment we got to that place. It was similar to the flat rock we had visited before, but bigger. It occurred to me that the rock, enormous as it was, had deliberately been placed there.
"This is another site," Don Juan said. "This huge rock was placed here as a trap to attract people. Soon you'll know why."
I felt a shiver run through my body. I thought I was going to faint. I knew that I was definitely overreacting and wanted to say something about it, but Don Juan kept on talking in a hoarse whisper. He said that Genaro, since he was dreaming, had enough control over his assemblage point to move it until he could reach the specific emanations that would wake up whatever was around that rock. He recommended that I try to move my assemblage point and follow Genaro's. He said that I could do it, first by setting up my unbending intent to move it, and second by letting the context of the situation dictate where it should move. After a moment's thought, he whispered in my ear not to worry about procedures, because most of the really unusual things that happen to seers, or to the average man for that matter, happen by themselves, with only the intervention of intent. He was silent for a moment and then added that the danger for me was going to be the buried seer's inevitable attempt to scare me to death. He exhorted me to keep myself calm and not to succumb to fear, but follow Genaro's movements. I fought desperately not to be sick. Don Juan patted me on the back and said that I was an old pro at playing an innocent bystander. He assured me that I wasn't consciously refusing to let my assemblage point move, but that every human being does it automatically.
"Something is going to scare the living daylights out of you," he whispered. "Don't give up, because if you do, you'll die, and the old vultures around here are going to feast on your energy."
"Let's get out of here," I pleaded. "I really don't give a damn about getting an example of the old seer's grotesqueness." "It's too late," Genaro said, fully awake now, standing by my side. "Even if we try to get away, the two seers and their allies on the other spot will cut you down. They've already made a circle around us. There are as many as 16 awarenesses focused on you right now."
"Who are they?"
I whispered in Genaro's ear. "The 4 seers and their court," he replied. "They've been aware of us since we got here." I wanted to turn tail and run for dear life, but Don Juan held my arm and pointed to the sky. I noticed that a remarkable change in visibility had taken place. Instead of the pitch-black darkness that had prevailed, there was a pleasant dawn twilight. I made a quick assessment of the cardinal points. The sky was definitely lighter toward the east. I felt a strange pressure around my head. My ears were buzzing.
I felt cold and feverish at the same time. I was scared as I had never been before, but what bothered me was a nagging sensation of defeat, of being a coward. I felt nauseated and miserable. Don Juan whispered in my ear. He said that I had to be on the alert, that the onslaught of the old seers would be felt by all three of us at any moment. "You can grab on to me if you want to," Genaro said in a fast whisper, as if something were prodding him. I hesitated for an instant. I didn't want Don Juan to believe that I was so scared I needed to hold on to Genaro. "Here they come," Genaro said in a loud whisper. The world turned upside down instantaneously for me when something gripped me by my left ankle. I felt the coldness of death on my entire body. I knew I had stepped on an iron clamp, maybe a bear trap. That all flashed through my mind before I let out a piercing scream, as intense as my fright. Don Juan and Genaro laughed out loud. They were flanking me no more than 3 feet away, but I was so terrified I didn't even notice them. "Sing, sing for dear life," I heard Don Juan ordering me under his breath. I tried to pull my foot loose. I felt then a sting, as if needles were piercing my skin. Don Juan insisted over and over that I sing. He and Genaro started to sing a popular song. Genaro spoke the lyrics as he looked at me from hardly 2 inches away. They sang off-key and raspy voices, getting so completely out of breath and so high out of the range of their voices that I ended up laughing. "Sing or you're going to perish," Don Juan said to me. "Let's make a trio," Genaro said. "We'll sing a bolero." I joined them in an off-key trio. We sang for quite a while at the top of our voices like drunkards. I felt that the iron grip on my leg was gradually letting go of me. I had not dared to look down at my ankle. At one moment I did, and I realized then that there was no trap clutching me. A dark, head-like shape was biting me. Only a supreme effort kept me from fainting. I felt I was getting sick and automatically tried to bend over, but somebody with superhuman strength grabbed me painlessly by the elbows and the nape of my neck and did not let me move. I got sick all over my clothes. My revulsion was so complete that I began to fall in a faint. Don Juan sprinkled my face with some water from the small gourd he always carried when we went into the mountains. The water slid under my collar. The coldness restored my physical balance, but it did not affect the force that was holding me by my elbows and neck. "I think you are going too far with your fright," Don Juan said loudly and in such a matter-of-fact tone that he created an immediate feeling of order. "Let's sing again," he added. "Let's sing a song with substance. I don't want any more boleros." I silently thanked him for his sobriety and for his grand style. I was so moved as I heard them singing La Valentina that I began to weep. Because of my passion, they say, that ill fortune is on my way. It doesn't matter that it might be the devil himself. I do know how to die. Valentina, Valentina, if I throw myself in your way, if I am going to die tomorrow, why not, once and for all, today? All of my being staggered under the impact of that inconceivable juxtaposition of values. Never had a song meant so much to me. As I heard them sing those lyrics, which I ordinarily considered reeking with cheap sentimentalism, I thought I understood the ethos of the warrior. Don Juan had drilled into me that warriors live with death at their side, and from the knowledge that death is with them, they draw the courage to face anything. Don Juan had said that the worst that could happen to us is that we have to die, and since that is already our unalterable fate, we are free. Those who have lost everything no longer have anything to fear. I walked to Don Juan and Genaro and embraced them
to express my boundless gratitude and admiration for them. Then I realized that nothing was holding me any longer. Without a word, Don Juan took my arm and guided me to sit on the flat rock.
The show is just about to begin now,
Genaro said in a jovial tone as he tried to find a comfortable position to sit.
You've just paid your admission ticket. It's all over your chest.
He looked at me.